Inflation, why experts say it is unavoidable. I'm going to explain it to you in 3 steps. Step number 1, we got to discover what is inflation and how does it happen. Inflation, I'm going to use the Austrian School of Economics. I'm going to use their definition. It is actually an increase in the money supply. So prices don't necessarily have to go up to have inflation. It's just the money supply getting bigger. Now, the more common definition is, in fact, prices going up. And that would be asset prices or consumer prices. In the past 10 years or 12 years, we haven't had a lot of consumer inflation, although I would argue we've had a heck of a lot more than the CPI. But we have obviously had asset inflation because every single asset on the planet Earth is in a bubble. The way you get this inflation, it's pretty simple. It's more money chasing the same amount of stuff. And how much money is there? A part of that is due to the velocity of money, which is how fast that money is circulating in the system. So we have all these people here, and I'm sure something I did here was politically incorrect, but we don't care about that on this channel. So we've got money go from this guy to this guy to this guy, down to here, and how fast that money is going from each one of these people, that is velocity. The faster that velocity is, the greater chance that we have for inflation. The slower it goes, the less chance we have for inflation, the greater chance that we have for deflation. And all this sets the foundation for the rest of the video. Just wait and see. Why experts say inflation is unavoidable. Step number 2, we're going to get into the specific reasons. And like deflation, the inflationists think there's 2 main reasons: debt and assets, and foreign-owned USD, United States dollars. If you didn't see that deflation video that I did, you got to check that out. We'll put a link below. But basically, all the debt in the United States, the consumer debt, the government debt, the corporate debt, and the debt outside of the United States denominated in dollars is at all-time highs. Asset prices, stocks, bonds, real estate at all-time highs. And remember, like I say in every video, the U.S. economy is built on debt, asset prices, and confidence. And as we know from step number 1, the amount of dollars and the velocity in the system is extremely important. So if we've got a lot of dollars that are owned outside of the United States, that means the U.S. government, the Federal Reserve, and the United States consumer aren't in total control of the amount of money or how fast that money moves within the United States economy. And check out this chart. It goes back to 1952, and it's a chart of the average household net worth in relationship to GDP. So you see, going back to 1952, all the way till we get to 1971, and I highlighted that because that's when we went off the gold standard. The household net worth to GDP was right around 350%. And in the 70s, it drops down, and I wanted to highlight that as well. By the time we get to the end of the 70s, household net worth dropped down to 300%, substantially below its historic mean. This would lead you to believe that inflation or hyperinflation, like we almost had in the 1970s, definitely decreases the amount of household wealth. Then we get to 1981, and in the 80s, we found that we could start expanding credit to everybody. That's when Greenspan became head of the Federal Reserve. And he saw, oh, if I drop interest rates artificially low, it actually has a booming effect on the economy. And if I can create asset prices that go up high, we'll have what they call a trickle-down effect into the rest of the economy. So he creates artificially low interest rates that result in the dot-com bubble. What's interesting about the dot-com bubble, a lot of people don't know this, is it wasn't just about asset prices. That Greenspan was actually worried about Y2K, and he was trying to keep interest rates low as kind of a buffer. And as we know, the dot-com bubble burst and all that debt came out of the system. So Greenspan went right back to the old playbook, dropped interest rates to create another bubble. Dropping those interest rates artificially low was the catalyst that gave us the housing bubble in 2006. And you'll notice that that bubble was a little bit higher. But sure enough, that popped as well. We came crashing down all the way to 2012. And now we're way higher than we were in the housing bubble and the dot-com bubble because we are in the everything bubble. So household net worth in relation to GDP right now is at an all-time high. So you may say, George, well, that's great news, but not really, because as you guys know from watching this channel, incomes, especially on the lower end, don't normally increase. They generally stay consistent with inflation. And I want you to look at this chart and see what we have here. Starting at 1952, we've got almost the exact same historic trend line that we have for what? That housing chart that I always use, meaning that household net worth mean reverts just like housing does. So if there was extreme pain in this recession and even more pain in this recession, how much pain are we going to have in the recession that brings down the everything bubble and brings that household net worth down to its historic average? So what the inflationists say is, listen, we've got asset prices at all-time highs, we've got the everything bubble, we've got debt at all-time highs. That's what's leading to this, and that's a result of Fed printing money. If you throw up a chart of the money supply and how it's grown since 1980, it's almost a straight-up hockey stick. So their rationale is if the Fed keeps printing more and more and more money, how much money are they going to have to print the next time they try to reinflate a bubble? And the more money they print, the larger the money supply, and the money supply is at the heart of this all. And the greater the money supply, by definition, with the Austrian School of Economics, the greater inflation that we have. And the only other variable that we would have would be velocity. The bonus reason why experts say inflation is unavoidable. And this is a little advanced here, but I'm going to walk you through it. I'm going to make it super simple. The bottom line is there's artificial demand for USD, United States dollars. Number one, we've got the petrodollar, and that's the fact that oil has to be denominated in dollars, regardless of the country that's producing the oil. So if country XYZ wants to buy oil from country ABC, they have to pay for that oil in dollars. Obviously, that creates a lot of demand for those dollars that otherwise would not be there. The reserve currency, this creates tremendous demand for dollars that otherwise wouldn't be there. Most of you know what the reserve currency is, but as an example as to why this creates so much more demand, a lot of the central banks will keep their reserves, or a lot of the reserves, in United States dollars. The euro dollar, most people don't talk about this a lot, and if you've heard of the euro dollar, you're probably kind of sketchy as to what it actually is. It's really quite simple. You've got the United States right here, and there's all this money in the United States, all these dollars, but there's also dollars outside of the United States. And these dollars are in banks, and they're in deposit accounts. So those banks outside of the United States, they're fractional reserve just like our banks are. So they can take these dollars and they can lend them out, and this creates more dollars outside of the United States. These are called euro dollars. And unfortunately, a lot of these euro dollars will go to buy derivatives like mortgage-backed securities. And I'm not going to get too much into the weeds right now, but believe it or not, they will take these dollars outside of the US system. They'll create derivatives from the dollars. They'll also create derivatives from the derivatives that are purchased from the dollars. So you've got derivatives on top of derivatives on top of derivatives. It gets crazy, crazy really fast, but that's for another video. The bottom line are these euro dollars that exist outside of the US banking system create a tremendous amount of liabilities denominated in dollars, and that creates artificial demand. And one thing I wanted to point out, that there's actually more debt in the world than there is actual money. So that's a great argument that the inflationists use, that in order to pay this debt, you actually have to print more money. You don't even have a choice. All right, going back over here, what this artificial demand for United States dollars does is it allows the US to take on huge amounts of debt, and we get cheaper goods. So the net effect of that is Americans live way beyond their means. Another unintended consequence that's really terrible is it creates war and military spending because of this petrodollar. The United States is so dependent upon this artificial demand. Try being president of another country and proposing that you don't want to trade oil in dollars. Your life expectancy will be about 3 months. Going back to Americans living beyond their means. As an example, let's take one American, say he or she is making $50,000 a year. And let's say we went to this person and say, you know what, you are in luck. We're going to give you a line of credit for $1 billion, billion with a B. In addition to that, the next time you go to Walmart, Target, Costco, Home Depot, anywhere you shop, we're going to make the prices of what you buy 90% less. Well, what would that do for this American? Their standard of living would go through the roof. They'd be living like a billionaire or a millionaire. But my point is this American is the entire United States. This is what we were gifted back in the 1970s when we went on the petrodollar, went off the gold standard so we could print as much money as we wanted to, and there'd be limitless demand for those dollars that we just conjure up out of thin air. The inflationist argument is that if this artificial demand goes down, the quality of life in the United States for all Americans is going to go way down. And they're actually going to have to live, they're going to have to consume as much as they produce, something we haven't done in decades. The Fed would see this and they would come riding in as fast as they could trying to solve the problem. And what's the only thing that they do? What's the only tool in their bag? Is printing more money. And that goes right back to increasing the money supply, which is at the core of this entire argument. Step number 3, the inflation experts' endgame. I'm going to piece it all together for you guys very clearly in what I call the inflation doom vortex. And that may seem like I'm really being hyperbolic, but in reality, just like the deflation video, I'm not. Check this out. This is a math equation based on how much money is chasing a certain amount of goods and services. So if the inflation genie gets out of that bottle, that's going to increase the interest rates at the long end of the yield curve, meaning higher bond yields. If bond yields go up, that means the cost of servicing all of these massive amounts of debts that we have in the United States, that goes up as well. That crashes the economy. A real world example that I can give you. Right now, think of the housing market, and we've got maybe what, 3-4% mortgage rates. Imagine the housing market if in the next 2 months, mortgage rates went to 10%. What would that do to the housing market? What would that do to the economy? That's the scenario that I'm talking about here times 1,000. So this crashes the economy, the Fed steps in, and they have to print money in order to keep these bond yields down because they know that if they don't, the economy is going to go further into the toilet. But what this does is this creates more inflation, which puts more upward pressure on these bonds, which makes the Fed print even more. This is this doom kind of vortex cycle that would be almost impossible to get out of. If you guys say, well, yeah, George, that sounds very unreasonable. I don't see that happening. Right, let's go back to the 1970s. Remember Carter bonds? If you don't know what Carter bonds were, I'll explain it to you right now. That was United States debt issued in currency other than the United States dollar. Why? Because no one that was buying our debt wanted the dollars. It sounds insane to say that in today's day and age, but it's very true. 50 years ago, the US was issuing bonds in other currencies because the value of our currency was going down so fast. And if you think that sounds scary, let's not forget in step number 2, remember we had all of these foreigners that own United States dollars? What happens if they see this start to play out and they see inflation pick up? They see the value, the purchasing power of these dollars that they have start to go down very fast. They're going to take those dollars and they're going to sell them as fast as they possibly can. They're going to inject them into the system, and that's going to increase the velocity. And as you guys know, the faster that velocity, the more the money supply, the more inflation that you get. So this is like taking a fire hose and spraying it onto the fire But instead of water coming out of the fire hose, you've got gasoline coming out of the fire hose. And if that's not scary enough, remember we've got the petrodollar and the reserve status of the currency. So if all these people selling oil saw the value of the dollar going down, just like the foreigners that are holding United States dollars, they're going to say, listen, I don't want any more of these dollars. I don't want you to give me dollars for this oil. I want to take euros, or I want to take won. I want to take anything other than the dollar. And if you say, yeah, George, but that's not going to happen because we have the largest military in the world and our military would step right in. Really, if the value of our dollar is plummeting, that means the amount of debt that we can issue goes down dramatically. If we can't issue as much debt, guess what we can't do any spending on? You got it, the military. And all these central banks that have all these dollars in reserves, when they see that money tanking, they're also going to flood the system with even more dollars. So the end game is that we have an option. We can go to 1980s style Paul Volcker, where we jack interest rates so high that it completely crushes the economy and it wipes out all of that malinvestment and all of that excessive debt that we have in the system. The problem is that would be about 1,000 times greater now than it was back in the early 80s. Because if back in the early 80s we had this much malinvestment and debt, now we've got, I mean, the board isn't even big enough. We've got, let's go to right here, all the way down. That's what it looks like, but it goes way up to my ceiling here. We don't have enough room in the frame of the camera to show how much malinvestment and debt we have in the system now. That's why it would be so much worse. And you'd have to argue that the politicians would be willing to swallow that pill, stop printing, and jack up those interest rates. Because the only other option, once they paint themselves into that corner, is hyperinflation. And I'm not talking about the hyperinflation in the 1970s. I'm talking about hyperinflation of Weimar Germany, Argentina, and Venezuela. I've got two pieces of advice for you. Number one is make sure you own gold, for sure. And number two is check out this content right here. It shows you the flip side of this argument, which is deflation, and I will see you on the next video.